I'm Douglas Kellner. I teach philosophy, social theory, and cultural studies at UCLA. I'm author of a book on critical theory, Marxism and modernity on the Frankfurt School. I'm co-editor of a critical theory reader and author of a book on Herbert Marcuse. Today, the great minds of the Western intellectual tradition that we are going to engage are indeed the members of the so-called Frankfurt School, who developed highly original and provocative perspectives on contemporary civilization with critiques of state and monopoly capitalism, advanced industrial society, the culture industry, and the high-tech and consumer society that we find ourselves in. The Frankfurt School provided some of the first critical and penetrating critiques of the modern contemporary era. The term Frankfurt School refers to a group of German and American scholars who worked first in Frankfurt, Germany in the 1930s. They were Jews, they were radicals, so when Hitler and the Nazis came into power, they were forced to go into exile. They emigrated to the United States, and they ended up at Columbia University, where they continued their work in philosophy, social theory, and attempting to develop a theory, or critical theory, of the contemporary era. The members of the Frankfurt School include people like Herbert Marcuse, who probably emerged as the most important and famous member of the group when he became the guru of the New Left in the 1960s and wrote books like One-Dimensional Man, An Essay on Liberation, Eros and Civilization, and many other very important books. The director of the Institute for Social Research that developed critical theory was Max Horkheimer, who is a very distinguished philosopher and social theorist who wrote many books on contemporary philosophy and contributed in a major way, as I'll indicate today, to the development of a critical theory of society. Theodore W. Adorno was another member of the group who is a major philosopher and social critic, perhaps one of the great theorists of music of the 20th century and one of the great critics of mass culture. Another member of the Frankfurt School was Erich Fromm, who became one of the most popular writers in the United States during the period of emigration, writing books like Escape from Freedom in 1941. That was one of the first critical analyses of German fascism, introducing fascism to an English-speaking audience. He also wrote popular bestsellers like Man for Himself and An Art of Loving that I'll discuss later in the talk. Leo Leuenthal was a major literary critic and cultural critic who was another important member of the group. And then Jürgen Habermas has emerged as the most influential contemporary representative of the Frankfurt School and is himself the subject of a subsequent lecture that I will produce for this series. Today, I want to indicate why I think the Frankfurt School is important, and I'll discuss some of the major contributions and limitations of their work. The project of the Frankfurt School was to develop a critical theory of contemporary society that would combine philosophy, social theory, economics, and cultural criticism in a new type of interdisciplinary theory. That was the project in Frankfurt, where they brought together philosophers and social theorists, economists, political scientists, to try to study the institutions of the contemporary era and to work to develop a critical theory of the contemporary age. Of their most important contributions to developing an analysis of our current situation of the contemporary era is first their analysis of state and monopoly capitalism that they developed in the 1930s when they were in exile in the United States. What they did was to update the model, the analysis of capitalism that had been developed by Karl Marx in the 19th century. Marx analyzed a situation of market capitalism, marked by competition between competitive family firms and businesses. The Frankfurt School argued that beginning in the late 19th century, a new era of monopoly capitalism emerged, a more form of organized capitalism with monopolies, cartels, and a bureaucratic state that developed a completely new and different stage of capitalism. Think in the United States of Rockefeller in the oil industry, of the monopolies in copper, in steel, in railroads, banks, that had a much more organized economy than the more anarchic competitive capitalism analyzed by Marx. Moreover, during the 1930s, that was an era of depression, the state played a much more important role in managing the economy. So you had a form of state monopoly capitalism, where the state was to provide jobs and welfare, to manage fiscal and monetary policy, to play a much more organized role in everyday and social life. There were two main forms of state monopoly capitalism, according to the Frankfurt School. First, there was German fascism, that was a totalitarian mode of state capitalism in which the state literally took over the economy, the political sphere, the cultural sphere, and tried to organize and control all forms of social life. The other form of state capitalism was democratic state capitalism, such as the Frankfurt School experienced in the United States. Think of Roosevelt and the New Deal and his beginning of a welfare state with fiscal and monetary policy, with new jobs, with social projects that would try to deal with employment, which involved a much more active role of the state in the economy than during the previous era of capitalism. Now, in both of these forms of state capitalism, the Frankfurt School argued, both its democratic and fascist forms, new types of administration, bureaucracy, and social domination emerged, cutting back on individual freedom and democracy. The result, the Frankfurt School claimed, was a mass society marked by homogeneity, by standardization, and social conformity, resulting in a decline of individuality and a rise of massification. In their vision of new mass societies with new forms of social control and domination, the Frankfurt School were the first to see the important roles of science, technology, bureaucracies, and the state as instruments of administration and social domination. Moreover, in analyzing the new mass societies, the Frankfurt School were the first to see the role of the mass media of culture and communication in reproducing contemporary societies. In Nazi Germany, the Frankfurt School experienced the fascist takeover and control of newspapers, of radio, of the film industry, the use of mass rallies and other cultural forms to inculcate German ideology, to try to indoctrinate the Germans into fascism, to sell the ideology of Der Führer, the master race, the German ideologies of expansion. All of these were reproduced through mass culture and mass communication that played a central role in German fascism. But, the Frankfurt School said, when they came to the United States, they saw that in the U.S., the instruments, the institutions of mass culture and communication were playing an equally important role in selling capitalism, democracy, and the American way of life. They argued that Hollywood film, that network radio, that advertising, magazines, newspapers were promoting the American ideology, just like in Nazi Germany, the fascist ideology was being reproduced by film, radio, and in the Soviet Union, communist ideology was at the heart of film and broadcasting, newspapers, and other forms of culture. So the Frankfurt School were among the first critical scholars of mass culture and mass communication who saw that what we call the media today were at the center of social life and social reproduction. This had simply not been perceived before, the essential central role of mass culture and mass communication. They were also the first to see that the consumer society was a new form of capitalism and was a new social institution that was integrating the working class into advanced capitalist societies and creating new consumer needs, values, behavior, and consciousness. During the era of competitive called competitive capitalism, analyzed by Marx, the working class barely had enough money to live, let alone to buy refrigerators, cars, etc. But it was Henry Ford who began mass production in the assembly line, who gave the workers a wage and enabled them to buy automobiles. During the 1920s and the 30s, union movements got stronger and stronger. The wages of workers went up. And particularly after World War II, a consumer society emerged in which new needs for automobiles, for refrigerators, for televisions helped create a new form of consumer capitalism that was very different than the capitalism that Marx analyzed. So they were really the first to see that the consumer society was a new social form and that consumption, advertising, packaging, design were very important parts of contemporary capitalism. So the Frankfurt School provided many important insights into contemporary societies, analyzing the role of state and bureaucracy, of science and technology as modes of social control, the roles of the culture industry, of mass culture and communication, the role of the consumer society, and new forms of culture. They were analyzing the passage from the era of market capitalism and liberal democracy that characterized the 19th and earlier 20th century to a new era of state and monopoly capitalism, a more advanced capitalist society. Now, in producing their critical theory, the Frankfurt School was quite eclectic, drawing on a wide range of figures from a distinctly European cultural tradition that focused on characterizing the essential features of the modern age. The Western intellectual tradition, particularly in Europe in the 19th century, attempted to analyze modernity, the modern age, the contemporary era, what was distinctive from the past. This project began with Hegel and Marx, and the Frankfurt School drew on the dialectical method and the vision of history of Hegel and Marx. The dialectical theory saw history as a clash, in Hegel's case of ideas or culture, in Marx's case an ideas of a clash of social classes, of ideologies, class struggle being an important fact for Marx in history. So the Frankfurt School took over the dialectical method that analyzed the tensions, the conflicts that drove history into new historical stages. From Hegel, the Frankfurt School also derived a sense of the power of spirit, of Geist, of cultural forms in human and social life, and they deeply respected Hegel's idealism and dialectical method. From Marx, they derived an appreciation for the role of material forces and interests in history, and thus of the role of economics in culture and everyday life. So in this sense, they were dialectical. Whereas on one hand, Hegel stressed the role of ideas and spirit in history, and Marx stressed the role of economics and material factors, the Frankfurt School brought both together in their dialectical analysis. Moreover, the Frankfurt School was very influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher of the late 19th century, and particularly his critiques of mass culture and society, his critiques of morality, and his critiques of the state and bureaucracy. In fact, in books like Thus Spoke Zarathustra that Nietzsche published in 1888, he denounced the state as the new idol. So Nietzsche was one of the first to see that the state had become a new idol. He was talking about Bismarck's Germany, the state in England and France. The modern state was the subject of propaganda, of celebration, of military display, etc. And Nietzsche was criticizing the idol of the state that had become a new sort of center of devotion. This, of course, anticipated German fascism that idealized the state more than any society in history. So the Frankfurt School was very impressed that Nietzsche had seen that the state was becoming a new idol, and they continued Nietzsche's critique of the modern state. Nietzsche was also one of the first critics of mass culture and of massification, and the Frankfurt School is infamous for developing this notion, this part of Nietzsche's critique. Nietzsche decried what he called mass man, conformity, everyone that was acting, thinking the same. Nietzsche was one of the first critics of the role of journalism in creating mass opinion, in creating a homogenization of thought and culture. And the Frankfurt School, of course, continued this with their studies of the mass media, film and of radio and later television, that was even a stronger form of cultural homogenization and massification. The Frankfurt School was also very impressed with Nietzsche's critique of Western culture, including his critique of morality, of religion, and philosophy. They agreed with Nietzsche that a lot of these cultural forms served to repress the body. They were hedonists, they were materialists who wanted to emancipate the senses, who wanted to create free thinking, free spirits, and a free life. They, like Nietzsche, followed the logic of liberation and tried to develop a philosophy that would lead to an emancipation of the human being. The Frankfurt School were also deeply influenced by Sigmund Freud, who they thought had deep insights into the role of sexuality in human life. And of course, they pursued an agenda of sexual liberation, most famously Herbert Marcuse in his book Eros and Civilization, which anticipated the 1960s counterculture that wanted to liberate Eros, that talked about love and talked about Eros and talked about play and art as emancipatory activities that would cultivate the human senses, emancipate the human mind and body, and to create healthier and happier personalities. This, of course, had a tremendous influence on the counterculture in the 1960s, and the Frankfurt School was influenced by Nietzsche and Freud in pursuing these ideas. They were also very impressed by Freud's theory of the unconscious, that we often weren't aware of what caused our behavior, that certain unconscious forces often ruled human life. They were impressed by his analysis of the role of the family and socialization in everyday life, that often problems in the family create neuroses or trauma that create personality distortions, that the family plays a very major role in the forming and shaping of the individual. On the other hand, the Frankfurt School were among the first to argue that the family was not playing the key role in socialization that Freud and many sociological theorists argued. The Frankfurt School saw that mass culture, that mass communication, that the state, that these social institutions were playing a stronger and stronger role in socializing the individual, and that the family was declining in importance. And they thought this also led to a decline of individuality. For whatever the problems or the limitations of certain families, the dynamics of family interaction, father, son, siblings, etc., often develop strong individuality, sometimes in terms of revolt, sometimes in terms of emulation of strong fathers or mothers, etc. Whereas in a society of conformity, where people conform to the ideals of the mass media, of the contemporary peer group, etc. Often individuality was on the decline and disappearing, and this was one of the major themes of the Frankfurt School, which wanted to save, to preserve, to cultivate individuality in the face of its erosion in contemporary society. It was the same with democracy. They saw as the state played a stronger role, as the media played a stronger role in politics, democracy was on the decline. As people were more interested in consumerism and the consumer society, they were less interested in politics and citizenship and democratic participation. So the Frankfurt School was also eager to renovate, to revitalize democracy in the contemporary era. And as we'll see, this is a major theme of a thinker that I'll do another lecture on, Jürgen Habermas, who made this one of his central focuses, etc. Now, critical theory is also very much of a historical theory that analyzes the changes and developments in history, that the Frankfurt School, as I've indicated so far, has analyzed the changes in contemporary capitalist societies from the 19th century as analyzed by Marx to analysis of its contemporary forms. Well, in the 1940s, the Frankfurt School concluded that history continued to evolve, develop, and change. So consequently, the Frankfurt School developed a new critical theory, a new analysis of contemporary society in the 1940s, particularly the book by Adorno and Horkheimer, Dialectic of Enlightenment, that was published in 1947, constitutes something of a break and a departure from the earlier work that I've described so far, and provides a completely novel form of philosophy and social theory that I'd like to now describe. Adorno and Horkheimer left Columbia University in the early 1940s and went to California when Herbert Marcuse, Franz Neumann, and others went to Washington to work for the U.S. government in the fight against fascism. Adorno and Horkheimer went to California to try to figure out what had happened to contemporary civilization. How had the world degenerated into barbarism? The Enlightenment ideology that they previously had followed thought that science, industry, technology, culture would create progress, that things would get better, that we were going to a higher state of human history. But suddenly in the 1930s, with fascism, in World War II, with barbaric war on a mass scale, with concentration camps and the slaughter of Jews, it appeared that civilization had collapsed into barbarism, and the Frankfurt School was trying to figure out what had happened to Western civilization. Well, the frightening analysis that they produced in their book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, was that the supposedly highest achievements of Western civilization had turned into its opposite. Reason and enlightenment were supposed to create freedom, reason, and democracy, and a rational society. But the system of technological rationality developed by German fascism created a war machine, concentration camps, and irrational war and destruction. In other words, reason was applied to German fascism to rationalize the economy. Hitler created the Autobahn system, the trains ran on time, the factories produced a lot. So the rationalization of the economy, of the state, of culture, had produced a war machine. It had produced concentration camps. That reason had turned into its opposite. So whereas science, technology, industry, rationalization was supposed to create freedom, happiness, a higher stage of civilization, it had produced its opposite. Indeed, democracy itself had produced its opposite by electing Mussolini and the fascists in Italy. Hitler was initially elected in Germany. So democracy also had turned into its opposite. Democracy was supposed to represent the will of the people, to guarantee civil liberties, political participation, rights and freedoms. But democracy, particularly in German fascism, had created a totalitarian, or turned into a totalitarian society where democracy itself had failed and was disappearing. And at this time, it could have disappeared from the world if German fascism, Mussolini, Japan, etc., had triumphed, etc. Likewise, culture was supposed to cultivate more civilized, educated, and humane human beings. That's what culture is supposed to do. Whereas the culture industry, Adorno and Horkheimer indicated, was doing the opposite. It was making people stupider, crueler, and less humane. That is, for the Frankfurt School analysis, the culture industries had taken over culture. That film and radio, television, journalism had replaced high culture, and rather than cultivating more humane human beings, more developed and civilized and educated individuals, it was doing the opposite. So Western civilization had reached a crisis point, according to Adorno and Horkheimer. This, by the way, was probably the first critique of modernity and the modern age of science, industry, and technology from anyone on the left. Previously, Enlightenment liberals, people like Voltaire, Diderot, early feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft, socialists like Marx and Lenin, all of these people were modernizers. They thought that if you develop science, industry, technology, it's going to take us to a higher form of civilization. Previously, it had just been conservatives that had criticized modernity. The critique had come from the right, from Edmund Burke, from Joseph de Maistre, and other conservative critics who affirmed tradition, religion, and institutions of the past over modernity and the modern age. But Adorno and Horkheimer described the unintended consequences of the Enlightenment and the modern era, in which science and technology had turned into their opposites, and that what was going to be, what was supposed to be, instruments of emancipation and progress became instruments of domination and destruction. This, of course, anticipated the contemporary postmodern critique that criticized modern thought, institutions, technology, and science. So, the Frankfurt School claimed that we need to reconstruct reason, culture, democracy in order to save modernity, that we need new forms. We need to save reason. We need to cultivate democracy. We need to bring back freedom and individuality. And the next decades of their work, they sought to overcome the impasse that Western civilization had reached, and to try to create new forms of thought, of culture, of theory that would reverse the trends of civilization that they saw in the 1940s. Now, after World War II, the Frankfurt School fragmented. It split up, with Adorno and Horkheimer returning to Germany and continuing their work on the dialectic of enlightenment. Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, and Leo Leuenthal stayed in the United States and attempted to develop critical theory in new and less pessimistic, I might say, directions than Adorno and Horkheimer had taken critical theory into. For instance, Erich Fromm published bestsellers like Man for Himself and the Art of Loving, where he was trying to cultivate individuality, cultivate morality and decency, to fight for democracy, for peace, so that Fromm developed a more positive and a more sort of constructive theory of critical theory that had quite an influence on my generation in the United States. He also wrote many popular books on Freud, on Marx, on Zen Buddhism. He was politically active, writing books against nuclear weapons, opposing the Vietnam War, and supporting efforts for world peace. And it's probably Herbert Marcuse that developed the most optimistic and emancipatory version of critical theory. His book, Eros and Civilization, that was published in 1955, with its vision of the liberation of Eros, his celebration of art, of play, and the aesthetic dimension, his critique of technological society, was a major influence on the counterculture and the New Left in the 1960s. Finally, today, Jürgen Habermas has emerged as the most influential contemporary representative of the Frankfurt School. His early work was with Adorno and Horkheimer in Frankfurt, where he wrote a book on the origins, development, and later decline of the public sphere, showing how democracy was made possible in the 18th century by the rise of newspapers, literary journals, and public spaces where ideas critical of the existing order could be discussed and debated, where there could be debate, discussion and consensus over key issues. Habermas eventually turned to a study of the most original and creative groups of thinkers during the 20th century. German Jews, they experienced the horrors of German fascism and emigrated to the United States, where they developed critiques of contemporary Western civilization. They're important for their interdisciplinary work that combined philosophy and the social sciences, and their project of developing a critical theory of contemporary society.